and discussion and webinar here on our briefing for nurses, a report on the Just Transitioning Listening Project. And in addition to the briefing will also include a little opportunity for discussions on this topic. But first, I just have a few housekeeping items. We will have opportunities for you all to respond via the chat. So we encourage you all to be interactive and keep your videos on if you'd like, and respond via the chat. We'll also have an opportunity for questions at the end. We are also offering nursing CE for this webinar, for attending the webinar. So you will receive an evaluation and a post-test to complete following the webinar. And just know to receive CEs, you need to complete the evaluation and the post-test, and you'll get that likely tomorrow. And I just want to introduce our first two speakers here, and then I will introduce our third speaker before her presentation. But first, who's going to give us a welcome and introduction to this topic is Dr. Barbara Sattler, who is the lead for Annie California, as well as a board member of Annie, and she's also the co-chair of the Food and Agriculture Committee. And we also have with us Michael Leon Guerrero, who is the Executive Director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. So first, I'll turn it over to Barb to provide us a welcome.
Thank you, Kara. And I'm really delighted that we're starting this conversation with nurses about transitions, plural, impacts on health and our role as nurses. And also delighted that we have our brothers and sisters who are coming from the labor movement to talk about the impacts specifically on workers. So we are, as nurses in the Alliance Nurses for Healthy Environments and other nurses who we welcome to have joining us today, we recognize that climate change right now, which is hitting us in the face on both coasts, certainly, with fires on one and floods in the other, is really going to demand that we have transitions. We must change. And in this discussion today, we're going to focus a little bit on fossil fuels and how we are going to need to transition to renewables, electric vehicles, public transportation, et cetera. We also know from our history in this country what happens when a whole industry leaves town. And we have watched the textile industry, toy manufacturing, the shoe industry, clothing, steel mills, automobiles, and logging leave whole communities and either go offshore, close down, or move to the south from the northern parts of the country. And you see the map on the bottom right. This Rust Belt began in the 80s. That's when we started to see the shifts of good paying union jobs leaving the country or leaving areas. And what we know in terms of fossil fuel jobs, and these are the direct jobs in fossil fuels, that 200,000 workers, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the US government, 200,000 workers in oil and gas pipeline construction, 55,000 in oil refineries, 139,000 work directly in extracting oil. These are good paying, family supporting union jobs. And we also know that we've got lots of gas stations around the country, and about a half of them also have convenience stores, but that's just something to keep in mind. We also know from our nursing colleagues in Kentucky that when coal mines close, we see a whole array of community collapse syndromes, but we also see individuals who have been in the coal mines, whose identities have been as coal miners, suffer from depression. We see more domestic violence, more anxiety among everybody in the families and communities, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of alcohol and substance abuse. Kentucky has the highest rate of opioid abuse in the country as a state. And then behavioral problems in children. We know that adverse childhood experiences can affect them for long periods of time after. So on the top left, over the last 10 years, 300 dirty, dangerous coal mines have been retired. And a win, this is certainly a win for the environment. but this is a serious loss for a third-generation coal mining family. And what we see for them is a loss of income, mortgage insecurity, food insecurity, a loss of their health benefits, and equally important, not just for the individual worker in the fossil fuel industries, but their whole family, a loss of their identity as being a community that has supported the growth and development of this country. The picture that you see of the oil fields here, that is the Kern County oil field, one of the big ones in California. And the tax revenues from the oil companies in Kern County are a significant supporter of the public health department, of the mental health services, of behavioral health services. And so when I've done trainings for the public health nurses on oil and gas and environmental health, what they tell me is that they are seriously concerned that if the oil companies leave and the revenues leave, they will not only lose their jobs, but they will lose the services for their communities that are so important to them. And we also just want to consider this today with our presenters. What are nurses' roles in creating a just and healthy transition policy or policies? And what are the practices? How can we engage in these conversations in our local communities, in our states? And certainly Michael, who's speaking next, will talk a little bit about national policies. And so with that, I hope that I just sort of framed this a little bit for nurses. We really care about everyone in the community. There are significant equity issues, and we just so appreciate the participation of the Labor Network for Sustainability joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Kara, for all of your work in pulling this conversation together today. It's an honor to be with the Alliance of Nurses for a Healthy Environment. My name is Michael Leon Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. We're a national network of workers, labor unions, and other worker organizations, environmental and climate justice allies. Our mission is to build a movement for a transition that is ecologically sustainable and economically just. We maintain the climate science and goals established by the Consensus of Climate Science is central to our work, and we work to build bridges between the labor, environmental, and climate justice movements to move together with urgency to meet those goals. This is a very important moment of hope, opportunity, urgency, and enormous challenges. As Barbara mentioned, once again, we're experiencing another round of intensifying climate disasters. There are also historic opportunities to address the climate crisis now at the federal level that we haven't had in a few years. With the bipartisan infrastructure deal and reconciliation legislation, there's a potential to raise over $4 trillion in infrastructure development and the care economy. President Biden also established interagency working groups on climate, environmental justice, and economic revitalization for coal and power plant communities. The first time 3 such interagency working groups have been established. There's also reason for some hope. The Indigenous Environmental Network estimates that indigenous resistance has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions. And Barbara also gave stats about the closure of 30 coal-fired power plants as well. So there's a lot of progress that's being made in terms of addressing the climate crisis. And there are important labor climate initiatives that are emerging in states and municipalities like California's Labor for Climate Jobs, Work for a Sustainable Future. There's the Connecticut Roundtable for Climate and Jobs, the Maine Green New Deal, and Climate Jobs Texas. But in order for us to win big on climate, we still need to overcome major fault lines between the climate and labor movements that threaten to thwart bold and ambitious policy. The AFL-CIO and the Biden administration, for instance, continue to embrace an all of the above energy strategy with heavy investments proposed for carbon capture and storage, CO2 pipelines, and nuclear energy. And we have to overcome the skepticism in the labor movement about just transition. So there are three important elements needed for society to transition workers and communities to a climate-safe economy. One is jobs, which I've said a bit about. Second is high road labor standards so that workers can organize for good jobs in the emerging green industries. Good labor policy is good climate policy, and we all, as the labor and environmental movements, need to embrace that. The PRO Act, of course, would be an essential step forward in this regard. And then the third area is safety nets and the infrastructure needed to support workers and communities through the transition. And this is the area that unfortunately is given the least amount of attention and resources. The Biden administration, as I mentioned, established an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. They've identified so far $39 billion in existing federal funds to support these communities, but it's far short of what's needed to address the scale of the problem. The Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst proposes a just transition program for the roughly 2.2 million workers that will be displaced from fossil fuel industries. That will cost roughly $1.2 billion a year from 2021 to 2030 and go up to $3.8 billion a year from 2031 to 2050. And this doesn't account for many thousands of workers that will be displaced from other industries like auto manufacturing, transportation, and others. Major economic shifts, as Barbara referred to, have too often left workers and communities behind. Jobs in the renewable industry are generally not unionized. They don't pay comparable wages and may not exist in the communities where workers will lose their jobs. So not surprisingly, many workers and union leaders are skeptical of the idea of a just transition. And because of the poor history of supporting workers and community through economic transitions, we decided that the best way to develop good programs would be to learn from the people who experienced them firsthand. So the Just Transition Listening Project was a year-long effort that involved many people, including an organizing committee of labor, climate, and environmental justice movements, a research team of scholars from 4 universities, an advisory committee of labor leaders, and the board of directors and staff of LNS. The project really, though, was about the more than 100 people who were willing to share their personal histories and experiences living through these transitions. Their stories both inspired us and opened our eyes to the challenges they had to overcome and the ways that they organized to support their families, co-workers, and communities. And we really drew from their ideas to assure that workers and communities are treated as leaders and not as stranded assets in the future. So we hope that the project and the report, Workers and Communities in Transition, can provide new and important insights to shape economic transition policies and programs. Just transition should be central to the agenda of every union, worker organization, environmental, climate, and justice organization. Making a just transition program for workers a central feature of all climate legislation at all levels of government may make the difference between worker support for effective climate protection and a never-ending battle over jobs versus the environment. So thank you again. We look forward to having the discussion today, and I will pass it back to Barbara.
Oh, I think Kara's going to introduce Vivian. That's okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Michael and Barbara, for really setting the stage. And we're just going to do a quick pause here to get a little bit of interaction from you all in the audience here. So we have a question we want to pose to you all just to see how you all are seeing this in your communities and in your nursing practices or in whatever venue. So have there been shutdowns of fossil fuel facilities? And this could include things like coal mines, natural gas power plants, oil refineries, oil drilling, or it can also include industry relating to fossil fuels. So have there been shutdowns of fossil fuel facilities in your area in the past 10 years? And you are welcome to just answer as a yes, no, not sure. Or if you want to provide a little more context, you can enter it in the chat box and we'll give folks just a minute or two to enter any responses. And you can either share this with everyone or share it with the presenter. See some, actually quite a few yeses. Not sure, some no's. Give everyone just another minute to enter responses. Couple more yeses, a couple not sure's. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for your participation here. We are gonna move into our second portion of the webinar here and hear more about the findings from the Just Transition and Listening Project. And so I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Vivian Price, who is our next speaker. And Dr. Price is a professor of interdisciplinary and labor studies at California State University. And she is a former factory and refinery worker and union electrician. Her published research centers on gender, race, and labor in construction, as well as labor and climate justice. She's also a filmmaker, most recently co-director of Harvest of Loneliness on the Bracero program with Gilbert G. Gutierrez. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Price.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure listening to all of you talking about the issues that we're discussing today. And let me just share my screen. And I look forward to hearing from our participants after we go through this presentation in breakout sessions to let people discuss some of the issues that we're talking about today. My part of the program is to talk about the findings and recommendations from the Just Transition Listening Project. And Barbara and Michael have already touched on some of the points that I was going to make, but repetition is always useful for learning. And let's just remind ourselves that the Green New Deal and other proposals come out of the need for action against climate change. And we know that human activities have warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land to a level unprecedented in the last 2,000 years with grave consequences. And so we see fossil fuel from burning energy, transportation, as well as deforestation, agriculture, and livestock. These are some of the leading contributors to climate change. But as we can try to control the human activity that causes climate change, what happens to the workers and communities who rely on the money and on the jobs that are part of the fossil fuel economy, the communities that have also been impacted in very crucial ways from dealing with asthma, cancer, et cetera. And then communities who will host renewable energy projects in the future. What are their rights? And a lot of times these are indigenous groups who are going to be approached to see if their land is a place where, solar farms or wind farms might be situated. Regardless of whatever we, decide to do, a just transition must be part of any Green New Deal or any transition policy. Barbara laid out a lot of the points regarding how nurses are affected by climate change and transition. So I won't dwell on this, but certainly many of you are working with the workers who are themselves impacted in their own health by fossil fuel economy, but also stand to lose jobs, communities who are dealing with having fossil fuel plants in their vicinity. You see firsthand the effects of pollution and climate change. And healthcare competes for dollars with other demands on state treasuries, as well as private coffers, because we're dealing with the mitigation of climate change, the forest fires, the droughts, the floods. You serve as frontline workers. And, from this pandemic, we understand more sharply than ever how important people in the health industry are to making our, society safe. So you have a lot of influence, a lot of credibility and weight in saying how policy should be shaped to deal with this crisis. So getting into our study, the purpose, as Michael pointed out, was to really analyze how people on the ground experience transitions in workplaces and communities. Our main research question was, what is a just transition? What have you experienced? What was lacking in the transition that you went through? And what needs to be done? Our method was to have one-on-one Zoom interviews with workers, members of environmental justice groups, Indigenous groups, and frontline communities about their experiences with transitions and their ideas for the future. We came up with 3,000 pages of interviews from the stories that were told to us by auto workers and coal workers, people in power plants, as well as people who were in food production, farm workers, people who worked in shipyards, building trades workers, as well as those who were teachers and health workers from hospitals and nursing homes. We divided up our study into looking at the problem, looking at the process by which people try to work on a just transition, and then pathways forward. We've already presented our findings to labor councils, environmental groups, and we've done some international presentations at conferences and to universities. You can find the full report at the link, which has also been placed in the chat. What were our major findings? Not surprising, we learned that transitions are constant and inevitable, but the past transitions have been unnecessarily unjust. And why has that been? Mostly because they're driven by market forces and corporate interests without a safety net. The only safety there is a union contract that may have some clauses that try to help people. But these are not sufficient because, as Barbara's pointed out, our healthcare is tied to our jobs. So when people lose jobs, they lose their healthcare. So the consequences of transitions not only are loss of jobs, loss of healthcare, the revenue from the taxes paid by power plants, et cetera, and really also identity. So, people have a culture in their workplaces, in their communities. They're part of a longstanding community that identifies oftentimes with the industries that people work in. And they live under the shadow and have the pride in being part of this community. And so when these places close down, for example, Lordstown auto plant, GM plant in Ohio, these people had generations of family that worked there. And sometimes they were relocated. That was a problem because they may have a job, but they're breaking up families. They're leaving their communities. It causes major disruption. It causes weakness of unions, abandonment of communities, and industrial waste is often left behind with no commitment to what will take its place. So existing transitional policies are fragmented and inadequate. We do have some policies which, like unemployment and some rapid response policies that are spotty. There's really not a comprehensive policy to deal with the transitions that have happened in the past. And, we can see that to be equitable and to be inclusive, just transitions require a targeted and funded short-term and proactive long-term policies. There needs to be attention to local conditions. There's no cookie cutter solution. What was good for a community in New York when a power plant closes down is not the same as what's needed in Colorado. When their power plants close down, it depends really on so many factors in the demographics, the level of education, the needs of the community. So it's very important to hear from the people. It's important for workers, unions, to be informed about climate change, as well as communities. Labor and communities can shape policies and programs that work. The experiences that we heard from people, oftentimes really making highlighting the fact that their health insurance was so critical, as well as so many other issues in their health, their safety net, that they're hearing from people firsthand is very important. There's a need now for wide-scale dialogue, movement building, and organizing. So about a third of our interviews had been involved in efforts to create a more just transition. So this was quite interesting. We found that there was 2 ways that people were involved in these efforts. The first one was to address fossil fuel and related shutdowns. We've got several cases, Huntley Coal Power New York, where a state fund was created because in there, for example, the educational system was going to implode because they weren't going to have the revenue to pay the teachers. So it was not only about the jobs of the coal power plant workers, but also people in the public sector. The Diablo Canyon nuclear facility, another example of a process that involved unionized workers working with communities to get financial support from the Utility Commission and then the legislature. The state of Washington had a very innovative way of bringing together environmental justice, labor, tribal, and frontline communities to participate in creating a board that would distribute carbon fees, which would be paid for by the polluters. This was a ballot initiative, 1631 in 2018. It did fail. It was very popular, but at the last minute, the oil industries pumped in about $31 million. The state of Colorado created an Office of Just Transition in preparation for their coal power plants and some of their coal mines to be closed down. The workers in Lordstown, Ohio, created a full-service transition center working with the federal government, the Department of Labor, to create a grant to help go beyond this limited safety net to provide help for workers. And the Redwoods Employment Protection Act, this was also a very unique and interesting example of a congressional bill to provide wage replacement, job training, and early pension for all workers. And Indigenous people were hired to practice and teach native forestry conservation. These are very interesting transitions that you can read about in our report. The second part of the transitions came from organizing, making green jobs good jobs. As we noted before, Michael pointed out, a lot of the green jobs are not unionized and they're not high road jobs. So we saw that Steelworkers 675 in LA organized Proterra Electric Bus Company. There were 2 campaigns, one in LA and one in New York, to work with drivers of waste trucks to help them and the community get a safer environment and better driving routes on the way to creating a zero waste environment. And this also helped a largely female workforce who were sorting the recyclables to get better conditions, working conditions. And then Climate Jobs New York is another example of trying to organize for better jobs. Just to touch on this, this was really a lot of work for people to sit down at the table. So just some observations. I'm not going to go into this in depth, but who's involved? The importance of building trust among these different groups is very critical. How do we set the table? Do we have a facilitator? Do we, try to get to know each other? Very important factors, again, elaborated in the report, recognizing that not everybody has the resources to provide the research, or even to have people take time out of their day to sit at the table and work on these issues. There's tensions that people have, some distrust. So there really needs to be a process that takes place, and to build a shared vision and to build a plan that's inclusive and holistic with expectations and follow through. There needs to be a strategy to reach policymakers, and funding and implementation are key. So generally speaking, the policies that we need have to go big, to be comprehensive, to go wide, to deal with trauma and social infrastructure. And we see even just this week, there is a social infrastructure bill that has a lot of promise that's being discussed in Congress. And then it needs to go far. This is a long-term commitment of support and investment into the future. So we've got recommendations, specific recommendations for policymakers. We don't have to start from scratch. We can build and expand on existing programs. And I'll speak a little bit more about labor and other movement organizations. Just as we're doing today, we need to educate ourselves, educate our coworkers and association members about climate change. We need to form climate and future jobs committees. Environmental and EJ organizations have to talk with labor folks, with people around the table, to find out what their issues are and to build those cross-movement relationships. We need to advocate for policies that strengthen labor rights, environmental standards, and provide funding for projects that benefit workers and communities. So we're going to turn now to our breakout session questions. And the two questions that we've got, and I'll say that if you're in an even group, an even numbered group, why don't you take the first one? As a nurse in a community that might experience an industry and employees disrupted by transition away from fossil fuels, what kind of physical, behavioral, and mental health issues might we expect to see? And if you're in an odd numbered group, why don't you take this question? What would you want to make sure is in place ahead of time in order to keep workers and communities healthy and secure during and after the transition? And we could put those questions in the chat as well. So I'm going to stop sharing.
And I am going to be opening the breakouts in just a minute. So when you just pay attention to what room number you're in, so you will be responding to the question that Dr. Price indicated there. So opening breakouts now. Are some people having trouble finding is the breakout room not popping up for you all? Okay. Let's see. Hmm. Francis or Lydia, if you did you see a thing pop up on your, oh, someone, perhaps these people just aren't at there. I had to step away for a minute. Okay. Pat, did you want to go in a breakout or are you okay hanging out?
I'm okay hanging out. Thanks, Kara.
Okay. And Lydia or Francis, if you come, well, if you're there and you want to go in a breakout, just let me know and I can pop you in there. I don't know how to, I think I can post a message to the breakouts here. Let me see. Here we go. Oh, okay. It gives me a limit on what I can say to the breakouts. Okay. Hi, Adelita. Folks are in breakout rooms right now. We have about 3 minutes left. Did you want me to put you in a breakout room, or did you want to just hang out with us in the waiting room?
Oh, no, just, no, you can go ahead and put me in a room. That'll be fine.
Okay, great. I will move you now.
Sorry to
Yeah.
join late.
Oh, you're totally fine.
I think everybody's coming back. I'm going to ask people to think about reporting back from your group, if there are things that you'd like to share. And I'm going to just start off by talking about the group I was in, which was a really interesting group of people. I was in an odd group, but we really talked about both questions. People were sharing a lot of about the workers who had their experiences where people had lost jobs, for example, in Dayton, Ohio, or people who were dealing with even the threat of controlling air pollution in the Bay Area that might threaten jobs, and the discomfort and anger from workers there. So there was some thoughts about how important it is to have education early about why we need why we need a transition, what kind of transition we need, what kind of safeguards there needs to be in place, and that nurses should be involved in this training, and really to warn communities about how public health may be impacted by the loss of revenue, and that there's an importance in replacing that with being forward thinking about what kinds of jobs may come to that community and making sure they're good jobs. So those were some of the issues that we talked about in our breakout group. I'm going to turn this back over to Kara and ask, would you recognize people to share back from their groups?
Yeah, sure. And why don't, since we do want some time for questions, why don't we have maybe one or two groups report out, and then if folks are okay with perhaps sharing in the chat any additional report outs. And someone, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to share, and go ahead, and you should be able to unmute yourself.
I'm just going to put in a word to really encourage people to share back. It was really a great group that we had, and I'd love to hear from somebody else about one of the groups that you were involved in. I see some smiles, so.
I can share real briefly if no one else has raised their hand. We had a lot of really great ideas in our group. We had question number 2, but no one ever put it in the chat, so we had to kind of go by memory of what the question was. And we were pretty sure that it was what kind of services or programs should be in place before and after an industry closes. And one of the first things that one of our members said was Medicare for all. And then we said, does Medicare for all, that sort of concept, just include adults? Because certainly if parents are losing their jobs and there's health insurance attached to that job, children are going to be losing their health insurance as well. So really a lot of work needs to happen now and yesterday in terms of improving access to healthcare as people encounter those transitions. And we still have a lot of other things, but that was I think a really strong foundational thing that came out of our group.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for sharing.
I'll just say I'm seeing in the chat, Siri also is pointing out that the communities, even after the industries shut down, many people are dealing with health issues long after the companies are gone. And, this is another area that's makes transitions not just about jobs. It's really about jobs and communities for so many reasons. And it does have a lot to do with health impacts as well as income and revenue. So should we move into Q&A now? Because we only have about 10 minutes left.
Yes, that sounds great. And I would just encourage folks to keep entering any report back into the chat as well. And I know we had a question up above here, but for folks who do have questions, please enter them in the chat. Or if you'd like to raise your hand to ask something specific, that is always welcome.
Hey, Kara, the question was from Robin. I got a baby yelling, so if you could ask it, thanks.
Yes, and Robin, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, I'm having trouble finding it in the, oh, I see it, okay. How is just transition being managed across international borders with changes occurring in multinational corporations?
Poorly.
Well, I'll speak briefly to that. I think that first of all, the answer is miserably. You know, companies don't have that many, you know, regulations if they're going to move across a border, you know, to make sure that either the health or the site that they've left, the health of the communities of the site that they've left are addressed. And as far as making sure that safety and environmental standards are kept up where they're going, that's even less controlled. And these are important issues that need to be part of legislation moving forward. And we do see a lot of multinational companies involved in these changes. So that's definitely a critical issue that you know, thank you for raising, Robin. And I don't know, Michael, and Veronica is also, Wilson from LNS is also on this call. If either of you want to say anything about that.
Well, no, I agree. I think it speaks to the point that really just transition has to be an international issue. And just, you know, corporations, I mean, a lot of the stories we heard were related to NAFTA. So trade agreements have been a big part of this. And, you know, and accountability of corporations. I saw somebody put in about accountability of the cleanup in the Four Corners area. You know, that's something that's over the last 50 years, we've lost ground in terms of the accountability of corporations, regulations, rights of workers. So all of that has to be rolled back in terms of regaining some of those protections for communities and workers moving forward. And we do have to have accountability for corporations to move freely across borders without accountability, especially while workers don't have that same flexibility.
I
Thank
see
you.
that there's a couple more questions. Carrie, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna just let you all know that we do have 2 more questions. We have one from Barb that is asking if you both could just expand on what the Green New Deal is and how that applies in this situation.
Sure. So I can start off on that. The Green New Deal basically it would be modeled after the original New Deal under the Roosevelt administration. So it's massive investments in job creation, social services, safety nets, et cetera, except the Green New Deal would have an emphasis on also restoring our environment and protecting our climate. So the Green New Deal was, it came heavily on the scene when Sunrise Movement occupied Nancy Pelosi's office back in late 2018, where a number of youth were calling for Green New Deal legislation. So that was introduced as a resolution. It's evolved in many ways since then. So you'll see a number of legislative proposals that are Green New Deal related in some of the infrastructure and reconciliation bills. Build Back Better is Biden's kind of version of that, where he adopted some of these principles and different platforms that came about through the presidential elections. So now what we're seeing is there's still a Green New Deal proposal out there, and you might hear about the Thrive Agenda, which is proposed by the Green New Deal Network. That calls for $15 trillion or $10 trillion, I think, in investment over a decade. to deal with the scale of the crisis that we need to. What we're seeing through the reconciliation and bipartisan infrastructure deal is around $4 trillion and a one-shot deal. So still a long ways to go to actually meet the principles called for in the Green New Deal, but it's basically built around a bold and ambitious plan for creating jobs to address the climate crisis.
And I
And
think maybe we can turn to the next question.
yes, and I'll just ask them both since we have 4 minutes. So we have from Lucinda, what is the best way to find out when and where transition discussions are occurring? And then we also have a question from Peggy that's related to the Green New Deal discussions about many groups are pushing a new conservation corps, and just getting some thoughts on that.
Well, I'll speak just briefly about how people can find out about transitions, and that is really to get involved in the organizations that Kara and Barbara have spoken about. And maybe Kara, you can put, or Hannah, you can put the website in, because I think that's a wonderful place for nurses to get involved in environmental issues and transition issues. And then also just, being involved in your, if in the labor movement, if you have a labor or community organizations that you work with, that's, people will talk about what's going on, and, your interest can help spark dialogues around these issues. You can also contact Labor Network for Sustainability, and we could put the website for that, for our organization, in the chat as well.
Yeah. I would say there are both ways to find out where there are conversations happening, and there are a number of states, not enough where these are happening, but I think really the need is for us to initiate the conversations. So I think in your unions, your central labor councils, state federations, is ask them, what are we doing about this? Because that conversation really, it takes initiative for people in your unions to be able to ask and say, we need this conversation. Can we set up a climate caucus? Can we set up a just transition conversation in our union, in our central labor council? It really does have to be generated from below. And so we really encourage you all to drive that. And in terms of this, the Conservation Corps, I love the idea. We've been talking with Sunrise Movement about that for a number of years. And now there's actually legislation introduced by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There actually is a bill for the Climate Conservation Corps. And so that's one definitely to look out for. And hopefully that gets some traction either in the infrastructure bills or beyond that. So.
Yeah, and I want to say that just today I heard that there's about 200 medical groups that came out with an announcement that the COVID pandemic is dwarfed by what we're going to deal with climate change. So as Michael said, this is a critical conversation. And a lot of times our labor organizations, community organizations are swamped with so many problems, and they don't really know what to do. They don't know how to get started, or what people want to be involved in. So your voice is important in bringing this to people's attention. There are other questions in the chat about the cost of companies to retrain workers and what is the savings. These are really important questions too. Some of it's covered in the report, so I urge you to take a look at that. We certainly can talk with you further if you're interested in getting in touch with Labor Network for Sustainability.
I thank you so much, Vivian and Michael. It has been really just an honor to have you here, and we could easily spend a day. And I think many of the nurses would be interested in doing that, just really talking about how do we move forward as nurses and bring our voices to this incredibly important work. I'd like to suggest a couple of things. One is that The Alliance Nurses for Healthy Environments helps to facilitate a nurses collaborative on climate change, and Kara is kind of the organizer of that. And perhaps out of that vessel, we can create opportunities in the near future for us to continue these conversations, but not just focusing on the problem, but really talking about what can nurses do? How can the ANA, for instance, have a policy on just transition? How can our state nurses associations adopt them and be involved at the state level? I mean, a myriad possibilities here. And so once again, just want to thank you for sparking this. I think people would be very interested in looking at the full report. Hannah has put that in the chat. There is also the direct link for the Labor Network for Sustainability, so you can go there and find more information there as well. And thank you for the 40 nurses that joined us for this topic today. Talk to your other fellow nurses about this, talk about climate change, be safe out there. It's getting to be a dangerous world. And we thank you all for being here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate being with you. Thank you.